Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming out tonight and for signing up to my talk on fatal transport accidents in the West Midlands. I'm not sure whether the talk will cheer you up in the current climate, but at least it's a distraction from COVID-19. The talk lasts about an hour, which is a tall order for some people to get through. If you fall asleep, don't worry, because it is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it on the Bromsgrove Society's version of iPlayer at some later date. So let's kick off by talking about these accidents. Now, the area we're talking about is basically in and around the Black Country. It's not a comprehensive list of every accident that occurred. It's just ones that I've come across over the years and have kind of tickled my fancy, if you like. The talk begins and ends in Wolverhampton, which is where I now live and where I'm talking to you from at the moment. And in the time-honoured fashion of when I used to teach British social and economic history to students at South Bromsgrove High School, when we did the transport topic, we always kicked off with roads, and the first accident is a road accident. And then moving down to Tipton, we shall deal with canals. And having done canals, we would then go on to railways. And for the railways, two of the railway accidents are actually in the Bromsgrove area, which is just off the bottom of the map. One in Bromsgrove itself and the other in Hanbury, which is a wee bit further south. And the third accident by train is back into the Black Country near Brierley Hill. And that is, if you like, the most dramatic of all the accidents I'm going to be talking about today. The final two accidents occurred in exactly the same spot in Dudley, and they involved trams. In fact, it was the exact same tram which had an accident on both occasions. So let's kick off with road accidents. This is a bit of a blurry version of a very nice picture showing the centre of Wolverhampton. I would guess probably at some point in the 1820s or the 1830s. You can see St. Peter's Collegiate Church in the background, and that huge great thing here, this gas pillar, a gas light, which was demolished in the 1840s. There you've got a stagecoach in the middle, and basically it's a stagecoach accident which I'm going to be talking about. Now, when we look back on the stagecoach era, it's a very kind of like, it's always portrayed in a very romantic kind of way. I mean, I would guarantee at some point you'll have received a Christmas card with a stagecoach on it. But as you can see from this picture, travelling by stagecoach can't have been that particularly safe. The most expensive seats were those inside, but if you wanted a cheaper ticket, you could travel outside, as you can see these people here doing. Now, stagecoaches could only exist as a result of the fact that roads across the country were turnpiked during the 18th century. And this nice map here, somebody who's very carefully coloured in all the turnpike roads in Staffordshire, which comes down to the bottom towards North Worcestershire. And in fact, the turnpike road between Wolverhampton and Dudley is about 100 yards outside the window I'm speaking to you from at the moment. Now, when these turnpikes took over the road, they managed the road, they improved the surface, they employed engineers to make decent road services. And obviously they paid for that by raising tolls. And I guess you all know where that building is. But one of the other things that the Turnpike Trusts had to do, as well as manage the road and make money out of them, was they actually had to put signage up to indicate to travellers how far they were from certain destinations. Now, the coach we're going to be looking at in our first example tonight was called the Greyhound. And every night the Greyhound coach left Wolverhampton for Birmingham. And on the evening of Friday, the 28th of August, 1829, it duly left Wolverhampton and headed down the road to Birmingham through Bilston. This road is what would now be called the A41 road. Now, whilst the coach was travelling through Monmore Green, we reckon, or was reported, at a speed of about 7 miles an hour, the front axle snapped, a wheel came off, and the horses bolted down the road towards Bilston. Now, this isn't a picture of that actual accident, but it must have been similar to that you can see there. Now then, there were 5 outside passengers travelling on the coach, and 4 of them managed to leap off safely. Unfortunately, Mr. William Edwards didn't do so. The description of his landing said he landed on his feet first of all, but then fell over almost straight away, fracturing his skull on the road as he did so. As was usual in those days, the wounded person was carried into the nearest pub, and the local surgeon was summoned to try and deal with his injuries. Now, I wanted to plot exactly where I thought this accident took place. Now, this map is much later. Wolverhampton town centre is up to the top left-hand corner, and the road runs down diagonally across the map. The canal, which you can see from the top coming down, the Birmingham Canal navigation, that was there at the time in 1829, but the railway line, the Stour Valley line, which is, you know, the main railway line from Birmingham into Wolverhampton, hadn't been built. Neither had the Wolverhampton Workhouse, which you can see up this is the new Poor Law Workhouse, nor the Staffordshire General Hospital. And that's the hospital which is called the Royal. You might well have heard of the Royal Hospital in Wolverhampton. If you know this road into Wolverhampton, the shops nearby, which I often find myself dragged into, are Dunelm, which is now on the site of the workhouse, and just across the road, Go Outdoors. Not much going outdoors at the moment, but there you go. So the Greyhound coach comes bombing down the road, and I think the accident happened round about here. It just come over the canal bridge where there's a distinct slope going down towards Bilston, and that's where the wheel fell off. The poor gentleman was carried, I would reckon, into that pub, which is the Red Lion pub on the corner of Cable Street, which I'm guessing probably was there in 1829. Now, this is an interesting picture of something to do with a coach. I can't quite work out what's happening in this picture, whether the passengers are being blown off the coach in a high wind or they've been imbibing too much of wacky backy. But one way or another, they all seem pretty spaced out. Now, the following day, poor Mr. William Edwards died. He survived until 4 o'clock in the morning when he died from his fractured skull. There was a coroner's inquest, which was organised by a gentleman called Mr. Henry Smith, who was a South Staffordshire coroner. And the verdict of the jury was it was an accidental death. They made a particular point of saying that the coach driver, Mr. Booth, was not responsible. But they laid down what was called a deodand of 20 shillings on the coach. Now, if you've not come across this idea before, the deodand, what this meant was that the coach was deemed to have caused the death or the accident, and as an inanimate object, it was blamed. Now, what they did was they on the basis of how much the coach was worth, they levied, if you like, a fine on the coach. And usually that would go to the government, who would donate it to good causes. But in this case, Edwards' family were granted 20 shillings compensation based on this. We'll come back to the idea of deodans in a minute, and you'll find out when it was and why they got rid of them. Now, moving on to canal accidents. Now, I first became intrigued with fatal canal accidents many, many years ago when I was researching the cholera epidemics in Bromsgrove. And I was looking for information about the 1832 cholera epidemic. Now, as you all know, that predates the compulsory registration of births, deaths and marriages. And so I was relying on parish registers, particularly burial registers, and some of the vicars of parishes in the Bromsgrove area where the canal went through them very kindly wrote in the margin that someone had died from cholera. They didn't have to, they weren't required to write cause of death, but they did that. But what I noticed at the time was how often they would also add whether somebody had died in the canal. And I was quite shocked by how many canal fatalities there were. And I actually would call this carnage in slow motion, because it was like endemic, so much so that people hardly noticed it was going on. Now, when I was looking for canals in our area to look at, obviously there's plenty of them to go by because the whole area is completely riddled with canals. Now, what I was looking for was, say, a serious single accident. There isn't one. There's nothing, for example, to compete with this accident. The Great Barge explosion, which happened on the Regents Canal in London in October 1874. Now, this happened at 5:05 in the morning when a flotilla of what were called monkey boats were en route from the powder mills at Waltham Abbey in Essex to Derby. They'd sailed down the River Lee, taken a right turn at Victoria Park, headed across London, and then just as they were going across the top of Regent's Park in St John's Wood, 5 tons of gunpowder exploded. It scared the living daylights out of the animals at London Zoo, evidently, and 4 people were killed. In fact, I think one of the bodies of the boatman was never actually recovered. Now, what's interesting is, an hour or two earlier, this flotilla had sailed through South Hackney. And at that time, my family lived in a property beside the canal. So if the explosion had happened a couple of hours earlier, someone else would be doing this presentation this evening and not me. There you are, that's something to think about. Now, I'm just showing this to you as an example of a dramatic canal accident. But when I was doing the research and reading through the newspaper accounts, I discovered that one of the canal boatmen who died was a man called William Taylor, who came from the Dudley area. I suppose people who worked on the canals could come from all over the country. And so accidentally, I discovered somebody who actually did relate to the area that I'm going to be looking at. But what I've decided to do instead was to look at the consequences of living right next to the canal or the cut. And I've focused my attention on Tipton. Now then, this is a very important point on the canal network. For those of you who are canal buffs, you'll possibly know this. To the bottom right of the picture, the canal goes up to Wolverhampton. And there to the right, past that red boat behind the trees, that is the old James Brindley Canal, the original canal. To the left, under the bridge, that is the new extension built by Thomas Telford in the 1820s, the new main line as it was called. Well, we're going to concentrate on this bit to the right. We're going to go along the towpath past that red boat. This little map shows you. That's the bridge, which this photograph you've just been looking at was taken from. So we're going to go in this direction into the centre of Tipton, not straight down the new canal. Now, that new part of the canal did actually generate this very nice picture. Rather distorted perspective on it, but it's a nice picture anyway, showing Barrow's Ironworks at Tipton, where the artist has actually shown the canal, but also a railway train in the distance as well, which is quite nice. Now, let's go back into Tipton, to the Bloomfield area. Now, this nice picture, you can see the houses right beside the canal. There you can see in the distance there, St Matthew's Church in Dudley Road, Tipton. And there behind it, you've got Castle Hill. Now, I tried to take a photograph from pretty much this same spot this time last year. And that's what I came up with. So you can see the church. And then if you look closely, you can just probably make out the castle on top of the hill. So you can see how close to Dudley you actually are. We'll follow the canal round. And here we are. That's where we started. And this is where the canal goes round here. There's the centre of Tipton. There's a little junction with the canal there. And that's where that little part of the canal goes under the road and the Birmingham New Road into the Black Country Museum. And I bet most of you at some point have been on the canal tunnel tour at the Black Country Museum. So that's the area there. And of course, then the canal continues on into Birmingham. In the centre of in Tipton, you've got the Fountain Inn, famously where the changing rooms were for Tipton's possibly most famous resident, William Perry, the Tipton slasher, bare knuckle boxer par excellence of the mid-Victorian period. Now then, let's look at see what I've done. Using the British Newspaper Archive, I basically searched for fatalities at Tipton in the decade from 1821 to 1830. And what you get is references to when somebody has died in the canal. As I bring these up, you can be looking for any kind of themes or common denominators in the poor victims. Poor old Hannah Homer there, for example, it was a fit, which they reckon meant she ended up in the canal. The other two, it didn't specify. 1823, Sarah Eccleshaw, crossing by a locked gate. And I think probably most of us at some point have crossed the canal by the locked gate, a bit slippery in wet weather. Possibly that might be why she fell in. Rather unhelpfully, boat lad Taylor just fell in. Well, that's a case of stating the obvious, if ever I've come across one. 1825 is interesting. Thomas Jones was bathing and John Jenkins was trying to have a drink, and both of them fell in and drowned. Richard Bradley. Right, now we got somebody drunk. That's quite a common one, as you will eventually see. But possibly the most intriguing one of all I came across is in 1828, when Peter Ford allegedly drowned as a result of being dazzled by the light of a blast furnace. How on earth the inquest jury could have ever come up with that as a solution to the explanation, I don't know. And another intriguing one in 1830 was William Wheel, who stood on a cinder. For the idea of the poor chap standing on a hot cinder and then hopping up and down on the towpath before falling in the canal and drowning is an image which is quite an intriguing one. Now, that's one decade. If you look at if you add them all up, there's 23 victims there. So in just Tipton, you've got 23 people who died in that decade. So I did a quick bit of research in the canal closer to me, up towards Wolverhampton, and came across another 16 people in that same period. And then on the Curly Wurley and Essington Canal in the north there are the further 4 victims, bringing a total of 43 deaths in one decade, in one small area. And it doesn't include all the Walsall canals. I just Googled that, put those names in of those particular ones. So 43 people in a decade. Now you only got to do the maths for the number of years canals were in existence. And that's the reason why I say canals demonstrated examples of carnage in slow motion. Right, moving on. Railways. Now, all of you will know this famous picture, the view of the Lickey Incline, 1845, built by the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway Company. The steepest stretch of main line railway in the whole of the United Kingdom. I think it's about 1 in 37.5, or something like that, from what I seem to recall. And in this famous picture, you can see Bromsgrove Church, the tower of Bromsgrove Church there in the distance, and the Malvern Hills looking just like the Alps over there farther away. Now, before I came to Bromsgrove in 1979, the only thing I knew about the town was the existence of the 2 gravestones that you can see in the foreground of this picture. And obviously they're the ones I'm going to be talking about now. Now, the accident happened on this site, but not in 1925. This is a lovely photograph. I just like the photograph showing you Bromsgrove Station, which in those days was up there at the top left-hand corner of the photograph with the footbridge over. And there you've got the Midland Railway wagon works. And if you look, you can see how it would have been built in various stages during the Victorian period. What I like about this photograph, somebody's pointed out, if you look closely there, you can actually see this locomotive, Big Bertha, built in 1919 by the Midland Railway to help shunt passenger trains up the Lickey Incline on their way into New Street. Big Bertha, variously described as being named after a German howitzer, or I've heard another theory that it was named after one of the Mademoiselle from Armentières, but that's another story. Now, the events we're going to be looking at didn't occur in 1920, they occurred 80 years earlier on the 10th of November 1840. And I'm relying a lot on Neville Billington's article in the 2014 Rouseler for a lot of the information which I'm going to share with you now. On that occasion, a new locomotive was being tried out by the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway called the Surprise. And on the afternoon of the 10th of November, the Surprise loco had been run for about 7 miles. Whether it was up the incline or along towards Droitwich, I don't know. But basically, this engine was designed by an American called Dr. William Church, and its boiler was built in Brierley Hill by Joshua Hortons. Very famously, there were several people on board inspecting the locomotive when, at 10 to 6, it blew up in the most dramatic fashion. Now, I'd like to draw your attention in this interesting picture to the spanner that you can see flying through the air, because that spanner flew out up into the air and then crashed through the roof of Bromsgrove Railway Station. We'll come back to the spanner in a minute. Now, 2 people were killed as a consequence of this explosion, and it's their graves which are now in St John's Churchyard in Bromsgrove. Thomas Scaife on the left was killed instantly. And when 2 days later, as we're going to see, the inquest was held at the Dragoon pub, which I think is still called the Ladybird nowadays, his remains were very carefully reassembled like a gruesome 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle for the jury to look at. Joseph Rutherford, who was a foreman in the engine house, despite being blown through the brass rails of the footplate, which you can see on the engine there what those would have looked like, he survived until the following day before he expired. Poor chap. Now, at the inquest on the 12th of November, the jury decided that the explosion had happened because of the problems to do with the thickness of the boiler. That was the reason for the explosion, and both deaths were deemed accidental. The controversy is that actually the jury ignored evidence showing that the boiler had not been well maintained. For example, it contained washers and even tools like the spanner that flew into the air. And what's more, the water, the whole area was covered with sand after the explosion because so much sandy water had been put into the boiler. Now, what's interesting is, and this links with the coach crash at the start of tonight's proceedings, a deodand of £60 was levied on the locomotive, because obviously a steam locomotive was a far more expensive piece of kit than a stagecoach. Now, what's interesting is there were so many railway accidents in this heyday of railway mania that basically in 1846, they passed a law getting rid of deodans. I think the railway companies were glad to see the back of them. The good news is, as some of you will know, that the accident led partly to the creation of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, where the plans for that organisation were first discussed in Bromsgrove in 1846. Now, back to the graves. Now, Thomas Scaife's grave contains the famous poem, which is copied, and I'll talk about that poem in a moment. I don't want to go all the way through it. You will know it quite well, I'm sure. But there's another little poem on Rutherford's grave as well. Now, the two mysteries which I've come across with regard to these gravestones. Firstly, the poem there. Now, it's nearly 30 years ago. I was having a conversation with the late, great John Adams, as you all know, was a great railway expert. It was when I was writing an article for the Rousler in 1992. And he showed me a book which showed that the poem on Scaife's gravestone was not unique. And in fact, we now know there's at least one other gravestone in the United Kingdom with pretty much the same poem on it. I think it's up in Lancashire somewhere. But the most interesting thing he uncovered was the fact that these gravestones were being produced by a company in the United States of America and could be ordered by mail. Now, I know a lot of us have spent money buying things online during lockdown, but the concept of buying a gravestone by Amazon, to me, seems really to be taking the biscuit. But that is what it said. Now, the other mystery is about the depictions on the gravestones of the two locomotives. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that these were pictures of the surprise locomotive. But as Neville Billington showed in his article, actually, this picture here is a more accurate picture of what they think the surprise really looked like, this vehicle on the right. I think possibly the most surprising thing about the surprise was that they put it back together again and used it for several years doing work in Bromsgrove. But there you go. Now, my next two accidents were on the Oxford, Worcester and Wolverhampton Railway, or as it was nicknamed locally, the old Wuss and Wuss, soon to be absorbed into the Great Western Railway. And the first accident happened on the little bit of line between Droitwich and Bromsgrove here, and it occurred in 1847. And the second accident happened in the Black Country at Brierley Hill 10 years later in 1858. Now, there's one person who links the two places. He wasn't involved in either accident, but he had an interest in Stoke Works down here, as well as Brierley Hill. And of course, that is John Corbett. Now then, you will all remember or know about John Corbett's Stoke Works, Stoke Salt Works, which he bought in 1857, made a lot of money, became an important politician on the back of that. Very good. What we're interested in today is the railway line, which was built to link the Midland Railway, as it eventually became, with the Great Western Railway. And that railway line cuts round the north of Droitwich, where it joins on with the main railway line at near Droitwich railway station. So here, this aerial view, you've got Droitwich in front of you, A38 at the bottom, and of course this parkland at the bottom is where the Chateau Impney is, which of course was John Corbett's home in the countryside. Now, the death we're going to look at happened to a guy who was a railway navvy. Now, traditionally, railway navvies, the stereotype of a railway navvy is an Irishman, possibly sometimes a Scotsman, but generally an Irishman. But in fact, I think as they were building railways across Britain, local men, local labourers would have all got involved as well. And the chap we're going to be looking at was a local man who actually got involved in the railway construction. The newspapers report that in July 1847, the railway line was being built near Hampton Hill. Now, I don't know where exactly Hampton Hill is. I've looked at the OS maps. If any of you know for sure where Hampton Hill is, please get in touch and tell me. But it was between Stoke Works and Droitwich. And basically, if you look at the wagon here, what it looked like, you're going to see it again in a minute, tipping the soil to create the embankment. And notice the way the horse is not walking on the railway line, it's walking to the side of the railway line. Now, the clue to what happened next is in the churchyard of Hanbury Church, St Mary's Church, and I'm sure many of you will have seen this gravestone. For a poor chap called Henry Parry, who died on the 2nd of July 1847. Now, there can't be many gravestones where the manner in which the poor occupant of the grave's death is actually depicted for everybody to see on it. But in this particular case, that's what you're looking at here. There you go. So how did Henry Parry die? Well, I think the picture tells you everything you need to know. But to find out officially, they held an inquest at the Railway Tavern in Hanbury on the 3rd of July 1847. And that is what was the Railway Tavern in Hanbury at that time. Obviously, you know, you'll recognise that as not the Railway Tavern now. So what did the inquest decide? Well, they found that Henry was the 6th son of George and Sarah Parry of Lower Westfield Farm, Hanbury. And that he was working as a timekeeper, and he was helping the tip man, Henry Wotton. And the tip man was the guy who actually tipped the soil out of the truck to build the embankment. Now, the accident actually took place very early in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, and Henry had been working all night. Now, that gives you, I think, some idea of what it was like during the railway mania period, and they were desperate to get these railways built, and the health and safety shortcuts they took, working all night. I guess this was the middle of the summer, so I suppose there was quite a bit of daylight quite early on. Anyway, at the end of this night shift, our poor old Henry Parry was sitting by a fire, and a line of wagons were coming up, ready to be emptied. And according to the inquest, Henry Wotton called out to Henry, "Watch out, Henry, it's a right-hand catch." Somehow or another, the message didn't get through. Parry jumped up and he tried to cross the line, but somehow or another, he slipped and was crushed in a dreadful manner. They called the doctor from Droitwich, but by the time he arrived, a long time before, Henry was past all human aid and he died within 45 minutes. So not surprisingly, the inquest came to the verdict that this was an accidental death. I sometimes worry with these inquests, as you're going to see later on, that this line, "Watch out, Henry, it's a right-hand catch." Well, did he really say that? Perhaps I'm being a bit cynical, but we'll find out. So here we've got poor Henry Parry being crushed under the wheels of a railway truck. Now that's the poem, or the inscription, which is on his actual gravestone. Now, I've often pondered, why did his mother and father want such a graphic illustration of their son's death to be on the gravestone? And I think the clue is in those last two lines, which I've put in bold. I think they thought, probably in their grief, that the one thing they could possibly do was to try and prevent anyone else suffering in the same way as their son had. So this was a public health message was on this gravestone. And the picture was obviously needed because a large proportion of the English population in those days were illiterate and wouldn't have been able to read the message in words. So that's a sad story about poor Henry Parry. Now, the second accident, the one at Brierley Hill, or near Brierley Hill, 1858. Once again, if we talk about John Corbett, you'll know that in Stourbridge there's a Corbett Hospital. The accident we're going to be looking at is often referred to as the Round Oak Railway Crash, or as I've called it, disaster on a school trip. Now, fortunately, I don't have to organise any school trips anymore, which is a great relief. I wouldn't have been very happy if I'd have been in charge on this day, I tell you. So, what do we know? Well, this is the guy who got the ball rolling as far as trips were concerned, Thomas Cook. Yes, the man who started the package holiday, which all began with Sunday school trips, just like the one we're going to be looking at now. And of course, that meant for the first time, poor people in the country could go and see places they'd never been to before. It always reminds me of the famous quote from the Duke of Wellington, who said, "I hate these damn railways. They enable the working classes to go wandering around uselessly." Well, on Monday, the 23rd of August, 1858, a trip was organised from Wolverhampton to Worcester. The journey out went without a hitch. The train left Wolverhampton at 9:15 in the morning, and it stopped at every single station until it got to Fernhill Heath. Tickets, shilling for adults and sixpence for children, and it is estimated there were 2,500 people on the train. 2 engines were needed to pull the heavy train, which comprised 40 carriages. Now, they weren't the size of railway carriages today. They're a bit smaller, but even so, 40 is a pretty big train. It was actually referred to as the monster train. And everybody had a lovely day in Worcester, visit the cathedral, went to the market, picnicked beside the river, they said, at Pitchcroft. The problem happens on the journey home. Now then, they had to divide the train up because just like the Lickey Incline means you have to go up from North Worcestershire to Birmingham, you have to go up from North Worcestershire to the Black Country. And the steepest section between Stourbridge and Dudley was 1 in 75. So they decided to divide the train into 3. The first part left Worcester at 6:25 with 29 carriages. And then 15 minutes later, the second part of the train departed with 16. And then the third part only had 6 carriages, and that was due to depart later in the evening, which it eventually did, but as like the emergency train after the disaster had taken place. Now then, by the time train number 1 arrived at Stourbridge, it was 7:51. If you look at the time train number 2 arrived, 7:59, you will see the 15-minute gap has been reduced to about 7 or 8 minutes, as obviously the lighter train was catching up the heavier one. Now then, by 8:05, train number 1 was approaching Round Oak Station, and that's where disaster struck. Now, to orientate you where exactly we are, if you look here, Round Oak and Iron and Steel Works with a canal going through the middle, this is Merry Hill waterfront. If you've seen the offices and the court buildings, which were built probably about 20, 30 years ago, they're on the one side, and there's nightclubs and pubs along this side here. Just below this road here is the Merry Hill Shopping Centre. Okay. So basically, the train, number one, is chugging slowly up this incline towards Round Oak Railway Station. And at that point, the wrought iron couplings on the train broke, as did the extra chains that they put along both sides of the train as like a belt and braces approach. And between, they don't know for sure, between 12 and 16 carriages broke loose and started rolling back down the gradient towards Brierley Hill Station, where train number 2 was chugging along. Now the guard, I'm not sure he was actually on the back of the coach there, but he waved his lamp to try and warn the driver of the train below that what was happening. He put the brakes on, but it had to no effect whatsoever. The driver of train 2 did see the warning, and he put on his own brakes. So his train was slowed down, pretty much almost stopped, just walking pace, at the point when the runaway train crashed into his train. Most of the carriages of the runaway train just splintered into matchwood because the engine, the locomotive, was much more heavily built. And what you've got here is this. This is the scene. This is an actual picture of the actual aftermath of the disaster. This, up until 1955, was the most serious railway accident to occur in the West Midlands. In 1955, there was a derailment at Sutton Coalfield where 17 people were killed. But in this Round Oak railway disaster, 14 people were killed. And because of the way the train had been divided up into 3 smaller trains, most of the victims came from a particular area, and that's Prince's End, which is near Tipton. And they included 3 members of one family. And that was the Skelding family. Benjamin, he survived the accident, poor bloke, but he died the following day during an operation to amputate his legs. As did his wife, she died, and their son, 17-year-old John, who had a fractured skull. Now, the inquest on this occasion, in a pub again, was held at the Bell Pub in Brierley Hill. It began in August, but it didn't conclude until October 1858. The jury at the inquest decided that the guard on train number 1, the guy who'd signalled to train number 2, he was responsible for the accident by not using the brake properly and warning the passengers in the runaway section. He made the classic mistake of jumping clear himself and surviving and allowing other people to be killed. Now, that's a bit unfair, I think, really, because surely it must have been something to do with the way the train had been put together, that would be the main reason. But anyway, he was then sent to Stafford on a manslaughter charge. But in December that year, he was acquitted. I think the assize jury, like I've just said, probably thought, well, you can't really blame him for it. But what's interesting is I've got this death certificate of one of the poor victims, a guy called Joseph Pitt. And if you look in the cause of his death section, which I've enlarged for you here, you can see it says bruises and cuts, manslaughter against Frederick Cook. And of course, this was as a result of the inquest verdict finally on the 6th of October. So it predates the fact that ultimately Frederick Cook was exonerated and let off. Now then, final 2 accidents, fatal tram accidents, or as I've called it, lightning striking twice on the Tipton Road. Then this lovely photograph of a tram in Dudley in 1914 shows you exactly the kind of tram that we're talking about that happened in the accident. And as to where the accident took place, I don't know how well you know Dudley, but you will know where Dudley Zoo is there, and Dudley Castle, all part of the one complex. And there you've got Black Country Museum there. We were there a moment ago when we were looking at the Canal accidents. What you've got to realise is this Castlegate roundabout here didn't exist at the time we're talking about. In fact, this little map to the right shows you that it was actually just a T-junction. And to the left here is where Dudley Railway Station used to be. And the tramway depot was here on the corner, as you're going to see. Other places to notice in our story are the factory, Bean Motor Car Factory, which is in Hall Street in Dudley. That's going to become important in the story, as is the guest hospital. The original guest hospital is this orangey coloured building here. The new guest is this semicircular green one here. And just across the road here now is where Dudley Archives has been built. Now, if you stand by that roundabout today and look down towards Tipton, this as I did a year ago when I took this photograph, you can see that there's quite a distinct gradient going down the hill into the distance. And the Black Country Museum is just down here. If we turn around and look up the hill towards Dudley, that's the zoo over here. There's the Dudley Hippodrome on the right. And that's the Station Hotel, which used to be a mock Tudor building that was rebuilt in the 1930s. But here you've got a tram of the same kind of design as we're going to be looking at. Now, I'm going to take you just across the road to look at this same view from a slightly different perspective. Now, this time you can see the Hippodrome there. You can see the hill with Dudley Castle on it. And you can see the trams coming down from Dudley. You can see the tram tracks in the road. And you can see how you have these points in the road so trams can change from one line to another. And on the right, you can see the tramway office. Okay. Now then, I'm just going to take you over that wall into Dudley Railway Station. And here's a view from the station platform, looking back up to where we've just been. And these buildings here were the tramway offices. And if you look at here, you've actually got two trams parked round the back, but they're both single-decker trams. Now, this is what this place looked like over 100 years ago. This is what it looks like now. Well, it looked like this a year ago. Obviously, as I said, the tram returns to Dudley because this is where the extension to the Midland Metro will come. Through these railway bridges here, it will come up from Wednesbury and Dudley Port, and it will come up here and then past the front of the zoo. Now then, let's talk about our tram smash one. 16th of January, 1916. You can see the view of where we're looking at. On that Sunday evening, tram number 4 arrived at Dudley Terminus from Wednesbury. So here it comes. I do apologise. This is a Glasgow Corporation tram masquerading as a South Staffordshire tram, but it's just that it was the best picture I could find. Okay. It arrives, and as it arrives, the driver, whose name was Joseph Penn, left the tram and he told the conductor, Mr. Timothy Parks, he was going to get his tea. So again, the same view, but mid-enlarged. There's the tram coming down and the driver goes off to get his tea. While the tram is parked, ready to return to Tipton and Wednesbury, it filled up with a large numbers of passengers, 30 people altogether, and about 20 went onto the top deck. And remember, the top deck of our tram had no roof. Okay, these people all worked at the Bean Car Factory, which at that time was a national projectile factory, because obviously we're right in the middle of the First World War. And that building is still there, the Bean Car Factory. So a bit of interesting World War I architecture. Now then, for some reason, and we don't know why, The conductor, Timothy Parks, turned the trolley round, the electric hookup to the electric line, and he rang the footbell, thinking the driver had resumed his position at the front of the tram. He didn't wait for the driver to respond with his own ring back, released the handbrake, and walked down the tram to collect the fares. So the tram sets off down the road towards Tipton, driverless, until a woman suddenly screamed that there was nobody in front. Parks then very, very quickly rushed to apply the handbrake, but it was too late. As the tram reached one of those points in the road, it tipped over. Where exactly this happened, I think, is probably just about here. The newspapers say it was close to the gates of the London and North Western goods station, and the railway line goes under the road, probably round about where those traffic lights are there, just beside the end of that building. That's the Dudley Archive building you can see there, and these railings here on the right, that's the Black Country Living Museum. So basically, the tram tips over. Now, this isn't a picture of that particular tram. I couldn't find one, but the description is authentic, describing it as a terrible scene, passengers hurled in all directions. I mean, it was bad enough to be flung off the top of a stagecoach in 1829, but what it must have been like being flung off the top of a tram, I don't know. I suppose in many ways, the miracle was that there were only a limited number of people who were hurt. 16 passengers were injured. Fortunately, the guest hospital was just across the road, so they were all rushed in there. One, however, Jonathan Evans, sustained very serious head injuries and he died the following day. One chap, Joseph Turner, seemed okay. He was released by the guest hospital, but then a fortnight later, he was admitted into the General Hospital in Wolverhampton, which later became the Royal Hospital, and he died of shock there on the 27th of January. So that's 2 fatalities. When they held the inquest, the second chap hadn't died. So the inquest happened on the 21st of January, and they discovered that the poor man who died was indeed somebody who worked for Harper, Son and Bean, the car manufacturers. The driver was censured because he should have taken away with him the reversing handle, which would have meant the conductor could not have started the tram on his own. But the conductor was deemed guilty of culpable carelessness, and because in those days that part of Dudley was in Worcestershire, he was sent to the Worcester Assizes on a charge of manslaughter. However, in June of 16, Parks was found not guilty. He'd already enlisted with the 10th, the East Surrey Regiment in December 1915, I think probably as part of the Derby scheme. And I guess the judge must have thought he'd rather he was in the trenches rather than languishing in a jail somewhere on a charge. In the meantime, he was obviously sacked by the tram company and was working as a furnaceman at Briley Hill. But what's interesting is, now that we can access soldiers' records, I looked at this guy's military career. And what I discovered was he never actually served with the East Surrey Regiment. He actually ended up serving with the King's Liverpool Regiment. And his records indicate he had problems with his eyesight. So I'm wondering if the reason why he set the tram going is because he thought he saw the driver come back and he hadn't. Now, believe it or not, almost 1 year to the day, an absolute replica of that accident occurred in exactly the same spot. On the 4th of January 1917, a Thursday morning, the very same tram, if you can believe it, number 4, arrived from Tipton and Wednesbury at the tram depot in Dudley. The driver got off again to collect his breakfast. So everything is identical so far as to the year before. The one significant difference is that in 1917, the conductor was a conductress whose name was Maggie Jepson, 20-year-old Maggie. She'd started work at 4:50 that morning from Tividale, and one of the passengers who boarded, but it was waiting, was a trainee conductress called Annie Payne, who lived in Dudley. Annie, the kind of like trainee, helped Maggie turn round the pole and then took her own seat. And then exact replica of the previous year, the conductress this time got onto the platform, thought the driver was in place and released the handbrake. So the tram sets off down the road just as it had done the year before. And at exactly the same spot, hits the points, tips over. 25 people were injured this time, and there was only one fatality. But that one fatality was the trainee conductress, Annie Payne. Now, that's the Dudley Chronicle description, a scene of indescribable pandemonium, women screaming, glass broke into, the car broke into smithereens. I often think with these tram smashes that they must have been a bit like seeing the kind of display cabinets your granny used to have made out of wood and glass with wheels on, crashing into each other. It was glass everywhere and broken wood. Now then, poor Annie was stuck, crushed inside the wreckage, and a doctor from the hospital and a nurse climbed in and they retrieved her through a broken window. But sadly, by the time they got her across the road to the guest hospital, she died. Now, the inquest findings are very interesting. They've discovered that Annie had only started working for the South Staff's tramways on the 30th of December, which was less than a week before the accident. She was going down to Tipton to be trained by a Miss Rutter. So actually that meant on the day of the accident, she was just a passenger like anybody else. I think rather conveniently, the witness called Winnie Smith stated that she'd heard Annie tell the conductress Jepson that the driver had rung his foot bell twice to indicate it was safe to release the brake. I wonder about that. So the jury in the end came to the conclusion that it was death from misadventure caused by the carelessness of the conductress. So they actually said that she should have made 100% sure that she'd received the proper signal to take the handbrake off. Now, this is poor Annie's death certificate. And you can see there it's got her address, the Belper in Dudley, tram conductress, learner, and her injuries caused through the overturning of a tram car in the Tipton Road misadventure. Now, I want to end on a high note, so let's look at a good news story. This chart shows you the number of people killed on Britain's roads since they first started recording these statistics in 1926. Now, don't we all love a graph? We watch them on the news every night, don't we? And it's going up or it's coming down and we all feel good about ourselves. I think it's quite staggering to think that in the 1920s and 30s, look how many people were being killed on the roads at a time when Britain's population was only about 40 million. And think of how few people had a car in the 1920s and 30s. Now, you can understand why lots of people were dying during the Blitz. And they were probably driving around London and places without any headlamps on. And it comes down after the war, but then goes up again till 1966. Now, I'm guessing that's probably round about the time Barbara Castle introduced a breathalyzer. I can dimly remember that. And since then, the death rates on Britain's road has pretty much gone down. The most recent figures I've got go beyond 2016. I've got 1,870. So gone up slightly recently, but they're all pretty low. Now, the good news story happens in Wolverhampton. Now, at the very beginning, I showed you a picture of the stagecoach that was travelling in here through this area, which is now called Queen's Square, going down Lichfield Street. Well, Prince's Square, just here, has a particular claim to fame. And the claim to fame is it was one of the first places in Britain to introduce automatic traffic lights. And here's a picture from the 1920s of them practicing these in Prince's Square in Wolverhampton. Now, they don't look pretty automatic to me with that guy standing there having to make them work. But eventually they were put above the road and you can see them up there. Okay, so they were truly automatic lights. Other places in the country, some in London, I think, were semi-automatic. So there's a health and safety measure which has probably saved a lot of people over the years. Now, there you go. Nice picture. Those traffic lights stayed there in place till the 1960s when they were eventually replaced by modern ones. But if you visit Prince's Square in Wolverhampton now, you will see a clue to those very important first traffic lights. The Wolverhampton Society, civic society as it then was, with its over 100 blue plaques in Wolverhampton, there you can see they put a blue plaque up to these traffic lights. And the other thing which you might not notice is, because they're so historic, they've been given special permission to have the black and white stripes on them. Nowadays, most traffic lights have to be painted grey, but they made an exception for the Wolverhampton traffic lights. So there's a positive story to end on, and hope that you won't have any nightmares tonight, and it won't stop you travelling when eventually you're given a green light to go out travelling again. So now, just before I finish, this is my shameless plug. The society I'm involved in, the Wolverhampton Society, produces a local history magazine, which is very similar in many ways to the Rousler. I wonder why that might be. If any of you would like to get a copy of one of these, and the stories aren't always just Wolverhampton, they cost £4.50, including post and package. But one of the big projects I've been involved in recently is to produce the first history of Wolverhampton in the First World War. And even if you don't want to read the bits I wrote, and I'm only the editor, you'd probably want to read the bit written by John Bourne, who's quite a famous World War I historian. They cost £14, including post and package. Now, when you watch the repeat of this talk, you can actually get my details, which are there. If you send me a check, I shall make sure you'll get one of those, or whatever it is you want, sent back to you. I must say to you that when I edited the Wolverhampton's Great War history book, the borders of Wolverhampton are very, very elastic, and they do include reference even to Bromsgrove. So you wouldn't know that Wolverhampton was such a big area, but I can promise you it is. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're all still awake. I hope you found something in that interesting, and thank you very much for paying attention. Thank you.